we'll get going. And thank you all for taking the time during this busy part of the year for joining us. My name is Don Taylor. I teach sustainability at Main Street Middle School in Montpelier. I also work for the Middle Grades Collaborative, which supports our monthly webinar. On this webinar, we discuss a variety of aspects of middle level education, youth partnership, and today we're going to be talking about restorative practices. I'm going to pass it off to Katie Ingraham. If you could introduce yourself and your role, and then pass it along to another one of our participants, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm Katie Ingram. I work at Up for Learning as program director, and I'm really happy to be here. I have done restorative practice work in schools when I was working in schools, and have helped do lots of restorative practice work with schools communities that I work with now at Up for Learning. I will pass to Kyle.
Hi, folks. Kyle Chadburn. I'm currently working as the Access and Opportunities Coordinator for the Orleans Central Supervisory Union up north in the Kingdom. Last year, I held the role of our district restorative practices coach, supporting teachers and administrators as they try to build restorative systems in their schools. So thanks for having me. I'll pass it to Evie.
Evie Gray. I teach up at People's Academy middle level. I'm an 8th grade English teacher. I'll pass it off to Christy.
Hi, everyone. Christy Beveridge. I am also a program director at Up for Learning, and I also do our communications. So I do our social media and website and newsletter. Really excited to be here and be part of this conversation. As Katie said, we do a lot of restorative practice work through Up all over the state and outside of the state. So here I'm eager and curious to hear everyone's experiences. And I'll pass it to Lori.
I'm Lori Ramirez, and I am at Appalachian State, actually. And I don't know hardly anything about it, so I have no experience to share, and I'm just here to learn. So thank you.
I want to welcome Lori for joining us. Lori registered via, I think, a Facebook link, and we're very happy to have you. Thank you so much, and don't hesitate to jump in at any time.
My name's Meg O'Donnell. I teach humanities to 7th and 8th graders at Shelburne Community School.
Thank you very much. And I have sort of a definition for restorative practices, and I just wanted to sort of read that to maybe give us a sort of an anchor. And then I'm going to ask folks to just kind of chime in and add or, debate anything you want about sort of this definition. Restorative practices are processes that proactively build healthy relationships and a sense of community to prevent and address conflict and wrongdoing. Restorative practices are increasingly being applied in individual schools and school districts to address youth behavior, rule violations, and to improve school climate and culture. Restorative practices can improve relationships between students and educators, and even between educators whose behavior often serves as a role model for students. They allow each member of the school community to develop and implement a school's adopted core values. In my reading, I keep coming up to this idea of really building healthy relationships and how those relationships can then inform what's happening in your classroom, in your school, and maybe even in the larger community. As I referenced earlier in the discussion, we have some folks who have deep expertise in restorative practices. I'm going to turn it to Kyle, who I know is coordinating some of these efforts in his district. Kyle, do you want to add to that definition and maybe even explain some of the nuts and bolts restorative practices, moves, or structures that one would expect to see?
I can try to add a little bit, but I really like the definition that you provided overall, because it focuses so much on what we're kind of considering level 1 or tier 1 practices that really support restorative work. I think there's a little bit of misconception or misunderstanding broadly when people hear about restorative work, they focus on the restorative part, and that's the kind of the far end of the work that we're doing, right? What we're really trying to do is proactively put structures and systems in place that allow folks to build those strong communities and relationships, and to take ownership of their community as an active citizen within it, so that way there's just sort of an intrinsic, I don't want to harm my community. And so I'm going to try to live up to our values as best I can. And so, yeah, are there going to be times where folks make mistakes or, things come up and, harm happens? Yeah. And then we want to have, those structures in place for how do we repair that? And that's a lot of times where I think people's minds go when they think of restorative work is to the repair part. Like, how do we deal with problems when they arise? But I've found that the most powerful work is really in that relationship community building that happens so that we don't get to that place or we don't get to it nearly as often. So I don't know if that really adds any to your definition or just kind of reaffirms, but if anybody else wants to chime in and share, feel free.
Katie or Christy, as part of Up for Learning, how are you seeing restorative practices, and how is your organization encouraging people to implement restorative practices?
Do you want to go first?
I can go. I can just speak to a couple of examples. So we're working with a school right now in Southern Vermont that is very much focused on RP in their school. And we're working with John Kidda, who's another person who's just tremendous in the world of restorative practice. And John Kidda has gone to the school to present. And so we're essentially working with a team of youth and adults to kind of define what RP is. And then, the structure of it is that we'll have our retreat where we're doing circles, we're sort of practicing circle protocol, and then the students will bring those circles, the same circles with the same conversations, to the faculty meeting that happens that same day. And I can say it's just so powerful when you have youth attend faculty meetings, just speaking to that relationship piece. The faculty are so engaged when the youth are speaking and they're taking them seriously. And afterwards they said to us, we saw these youth who normally don't step into these kind of roles, these leadership roles. And we were so happy to see them leading these circles with such, skill. And so just that infusion of circle discussions, bringing youth and faculty together to have conversations about the climate of their school has been a key part, at least with that one school in Southern Vermont that we're working with. But it really, I would say it informs pretty much all of our work with UP. And Katie, if you want to add on to that, but.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think there are many specific projects that come to mind. I think one of the main themes that we're seeing arise as a need. So I'm going to back up for a second. I think that one of the primary things to understand when you root into restorative practices is that it is steeped in Indigenous peoples' wisdom and Indigenous people's processes and ways of being in community. And our white systems of power and oppression that we exist within often can struggle to fully embody the systems needed to create a really powerful restorative space. Number one. Number two, I think that that being said, the organizations that have really adopted restorative practices at tier 1 and have done that primary relationship building that Dawn and everybody is talking about, both really embedding into relationship and circles inside of casual spaces, then they're really primed for that when harm occurs. How can we welcome people into the warm embrace of community? That's something a beloved teacher of mine, Syra Pinto, speaks about, is welcoming people back into the warm embrace of community. But first, the warm embrace of community needs to be there, right? So, and to feel experienced by the students and by staff. So that that is one thing that's on my mind. And then I think the thematic thing that we're seeing as a next level extension, once a nice base of restorative practices, proactive restorative practices exists inside of a school, is this desire for peer mediation. So how are students and staff working together, stepping into youth adult partnership to create these spaces, either like wellness space, like physical spaces inside of schools that are staffed by students and faculty together that people can access for their mental health, or a place of peer mediation. So how are youth stepping into the mediator role, helping overcome conflict and move into that next level of depth and understanding with restorative practices, impact and harm? I'll pause there. I'm sure there'll be more to be said.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Evie or Meg, did you want to add anything?
I don't think so. Not right now. Yeah.
Okay. So Kyle just shared a little document there. And one of the things in that document, I think it's on slide number 3, and this kind of leads into our next question. And the broad question is, what do restorative practices look like in your learning community? And this is sort of the nuts and bolts, which Kyle referenced in the chat. So if you're new to a community and somebody says, oh, we're a restorative practice community, which may or may not be the right term, what would that look like? And in the Tier 1 strategy, Kyle provided and Andrea Grattan provided, there's a daily morning meeting or advisory circles. There's community building check-ins. There's clear and consistent communication. And then there's also these regular mindfulness practices. Some of these I would tag onto what Katie mentioned are these sort of casual spaces where you're building relationships through discussion, activities, and maybe in some cases a more structured type of circle discussion or activity. And our question now, as I mentioned, is what does this look like in your school? And I'll start just by saying that we do employ some restorative practices. I'm not sure that we have a full restorative practice mindset, which I keep seeing referenced in the literature. It's not just circles, right? It has to be a mindset about community and about building relationships. But on a daily basis, we have advisory period. It's 15 minutes. My advisory group, we tend to sit in a circle. And then once a week, we say, we're going to have a more formal circle, talking piece, making sure we're being good listeners and being respectful. And then when harm does happen, we have had restorative circles, which bring folks together to have those discussions. So sort of on the daily, it looks like kids know what a circle is. We have those circles in our advisory, and we're using those both in casual and more formal ways to develop systems for communication and building relationships. I'm just going to ask Evie. Evie, what does it look like at your school, sort of a nuts and bolts look? And then I'll actually list folks in the chat so that we can just kind of popcorn around and hear what people are seeing in their learning community.
I would say it sounds like our schools probably function in a pretty similar way. We use the responsive classroom for all of our advisory. We meet every day with our students, 20 minutes at the beginning of the day, and our advisory is set in sort of that idea of relationship building through intentional activities, and all of our students sit in circles and participate in greetings and shares, and then we are sort of bring in the circles regularly so that it doesn't feel weird when something happens and we have to respond. And I think one thing that we're hoping to do moving forward is just doing sort of a weekly check-in of like what feels good at school right now, what feels hard at school right now, and then what do you need from each other, what do you need from adults, as just sort of our regular check-in to get some more, because things at school are pretty hard right now for a lot of our students, particularly our students of color. And so just like really bringing those voices to the forefront and allowing students to hear each other's perspective. And then when harm does occur, either out in the wider world or within our school building, which has been happening a lot recently. Any staff member is encouraged to come up with a circle protocol and share it with staff. I've done that a couple of times. And then, when we had an incident of racial harm happen at our high school last week, that admin came in and provided us with a, circle format to be able to respond to that as well. That's sort of the day-to-day. It looks like really grounded in our advisory system though.
Awesome. Meg?
Yeah, I regrettably, Shelburne does not have an advisory model. We do have started last year this Community Connect, which was intended to act. It was a once a week. It's about 45 minutes once a week on Wednesdays as an opportunity to have a sort of an advisory model building community activity that was intended to help build a 5-8 identity within this pre-K 8 building. We do not have an advisory. So we don't have a standing practice for circles, sadly. It's really left to individual teachers to do it as it's seen, and so I guess to just respond to this idea of relationship building, I think we feel that. Like I think we feel the lack of standing practices or standing training, I think, for educators across the board. I think we really see that in when kids are on team and off team. I think we see it in the casualness of harm and language that's being used peer to peer. I think, I think we have a lot of work to do at our school to head in that direction. So I don't have much to offer, and I apologize, but I'm very grateful for hearing from all of you what it looks like.
Thanks very much, Meg. Christy? Oh, I'm sorry, Kyle.
I can just speak to, so I'm not in the classroom right now, but I can speak to what practice was when I was in the classroom a year and a half ago. Basically, it's the outline that's in Andrea's document there. We definitely had an advisory program in place for our middle level. Looked a little different. We're all K-8 schools, and so it looks a little different in the K-5 classrooms, K-4 classrooms, depending on the building, as a morning meeting. But that's in place beginning of the day across the board in all of our district schools. I think it's implemented with a wide range of success and challenge. Somebody mentioned earlier, the adult buy-in is a big part of any system. And so the more that you're invested in facilitating the work, the more students are going to be invested. And the more that you involve them in the facilitation of the work, the more they're going to be invested. So we got to a place where we kind of had a mixture of teacher-led and student-led circles, especially in the morning, because they were a little bit more informal. We did use the same protocol all the time. So there was always a talking piece, always a centerpiece. But they were just they had a more informal feel to them. It was a little more lax. And then midday, we always, in our classroom at least, had a check-in time where we did just a really quick mindfulness practice to kind of reset midday. And then we did a check-in just to see how's everybody doing. It's kind of a Bill Rich taking stock kind of activity of what went well this morning, where are you at right now? What can we do to support you as a community, and make the afternoon hopefully go even better than the morning did. And those are kind of the routines. And then a lot of it comes down to just how do you do those more personalized check-ins with students throughout the course of the day, in the hallway, even something as simple as just greeting them by name in the morning, all those kinds of things that people kind of do instinctively, or a lot of folks do instinctively, I kind of fall in the restorative practices category. So I think all of that builds that kind of community that you need in order to do the reparative work down the road. So in our district, that's being implemented somewhat inconsistently, I think, and that's really the role that Andrea Gratton's playing for us this year and that I played last year, is how do we build capacity in our teachers and to do that work with fidelity.
Christy, did you have any thoughts about, I know that Up for Learning works with multiple schools. What are some of the structures that you're seeing that seem to be effective? I just want to also point out one of the themes that Kyle brought up was the inconsistency that can happen with restorative practices, and then this idea of teacher buy-in, right? Because if the adults aren't buying into it, then it's very difficult for students to respect the process. So what are you seeing across the schools that you're working in?
Yeah, I was going to speak to that, just the range of use of restorative practice, the sort of fluency that people have with it, the resistance sometimes that we see. And I would say there was a school last year where there had actually been like some real harm that had been done in circles, so that there was a sort of a stepping back from circles because of some harm that had happened. And some of the student reaction was really like, when we said the word circle, to be like, oh, circles. So yeah, just there, I really experience with all the different schools that we work with, a range of responses to it, of the teacher buy-in, of the youth buy-in, because they might have had a bad experience with it, or it hasn't been sort of an invitation to explore it. It's been like a mandate of like, you're doing this, and without real understanding of just what you were speaking to, Kyle, just like that it is about human to human relationships. It's not, it's not something that is beyond all of our capacity. But when people start learning new terminology, they get a little, what is this, when it really is about relationships. So it's been very interesting to see just the range of fluency with it, and acceptance of it across different schools.
Katie Ingraham?
Yeah, my mind's going in lots of different directions right now. I feel like it's such a rich topic. I think there's a few things that are at the top of my mind right now. One, I'm thinking about a restorative space that I developed and created at U32 for 5 years. And the positives and negatives that happened inside of that space. It was a restorative drop-in space for the entire middle school. So anybody could come at any time of the day. They had to ask their teacher. Sometimes they also were said that, could you go take 5 minutes and take a reset in that room? But it was both a space where students could come to work and get one-on-one, not one-on-one because it was pretty busy, but get targeted support with me, and we also had a behavioral specialist from Washington County Mental Health in there with me every day, and that was a part of the design of the space. So I think that some things that we learned throughout the course of that process and creating that program was that it was accessed by all different types of learners, right? There were definitely the frequent flyers that you would think of that need a space to take a break from class, and maybe you would overuse it a little bit, but then it was also used by students who really just wanted to come into a cozy space to take a test because they didn't get to it the day before, right? So I'd say that there was a lot, it was a really wonderful restorative space in that sense, because it created a place where folks could go to hold their emotions and to also access the really immediate support that they needed to get their academics done in the moment. And another thing that we learned and implemented was some teachers started to come into that space during their duty time or during their free bands to sit and like work in the collaborative space. And what was really lovely about that is like, if there ever was a student who was having some conflict with a teacher, if they came at a different time of day and their teacher was sitting in there, they could then help them with a different thing, right? And so I think that's kind of where my mind and my heart are at in the moment in our conversation, just thinking about the types of like healing and collaboration that can occur in those moments that are not necessarily class, and how do we create more of that in schools, and that repair. I think one thing also on the thread of people's conversation is that some of that staff, some of that faculty buy-in, and even students, I hear students say like, what's the punishment, right? They want a specific punishment. They want an outcome that they understand that feels like it's resolved. And I think the tricky thing about like the restorative mindset is that there's not always a clear and easy resolution. And in relationships, it takes the like ongoing depth to change and alter the way that we are together. So that's a tricky thing. I think Evie goes after me. No, sorry. Pass it back to you, Don.
Kate. Yeah, no, thank you so much. This is also bringing up a lot of questions or that I have. But before we get there, Katie Farber, thank you for joining us, and Joe Rivers. And just Katie, restorative practices, what are you seeing as effective in your work with educators? And, why would an educator say, geez, this is something I need to have going on in my practice?
Thanks so much. Sorry I was late, everybody. Katie Farber, she, her, hers, St. Mike's. And yeah, I'm just reflecting as I'm listening to you all about my practice at Stowe Elementary School, most recently where I was teaching. It was like Kyle was referring to more of like a morning meeting, but really it was like the backbone of the class. So when I think about how deep it is, it's really morning meeting and learning the protocols and the practice and the building the circle time and the community. And then that's setting up the stage for a midday quiet time check-in to regroup. After recess, usually people are pretty amped, so that we needed a cool down time then. And then we would have a closing circle, right? Which is shout outs, apologies, ahas, appreciations. And it was really the backbone of the day, the structure that we needed to build community. And then we were able to use it as we needed. We would do things like, what's the state of the class? So we would have a weekly check-in. Okay, what's the state of the class? Oh, the chords, I've lost chords, or oh, I'm frustrated with the transition to PE class, or, where they were able to surface issues that were important to them. We were able to talk them through and then come up with shared solutions. And so for me in that 5th grade space, and also when I was working in the 6th grade, this was a structure where students would take on leadership roles within it. And it really just, was what we needed in terms of a community space and accountability. And now that I'm working with, educators, practicing educators and pre-service educators, I'm finding a similar thing. I was working with some teachers that were teaching all day, and they're in a really under-resourced school, and they just needed a space to land for quite a bit of time and to unpack the contents of what happened that day and to bring up what they needed. And so I was finding similar structures being nurturing and supportive in the space of working with any population. So I'm reflecting on that moving forward.
Thank you very much. Lori, did you have any questions before we hear from Joe about anything you've heard so far?
Yeah, I have a million. No, I mean, I don't know anything about this, but I love it. I love it so far. So, and I think it's really necessary. But one of my big questions, I was in another thing on Tuesday, and they were talking about advisory, and that there were 12 kids in each advisory, and some were 5th, some were 6th, some were 7th, some were 8th. So that they, built community across grade levels. So I guess I'm curious about, at your schools, do all advisories do it? You talked a little bit about teacher buy-in. but is it expected in all classrooms? And then Kyle, you mentioned district-wide, so it's like a district-wide thing? Like, I'm just trying to get a sense of scope or how many people is this affecting? How many schools is this affecting?
Okay, thank you very much for that. Joe, welcome. Do you want to talk about if you're doing restorative practices, or talk to Lori's question, do you have advisory circle? Is that sort of just in your classroom? Is it across the school? And what are the expectations for you?
We have advisory. Well, hello. We do have advisory at Brattleboro Area Middle School, and we've had it for a long time. And it is an expectation of all of us to be part of it. We've tweaked it over many years and to a system that I think it's the best part of the day, and probably the most valuable part of the experience we have, in that there is a home for all students. There is a team structure. We have about 70 students on a traditional 4-person core team, and we have brought in exploratory teachers to fill out a 7-person advisory program on our team. Students run our weekly team meetings at the end of on every Friday morning. We have a pretty rigorous system in place that, again, it just feels like the best part of the day. So I can speak about that, but restorative justice at our place is just a phrase. I'm not sure when you say that, I don't know how or if it's operationalized in any meaningful way at our site. I think we have a very strong advisory program, and there may be overlap in what those two terms are striving for, but I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to shift my next question to folks, and I'm going to allow people just to popcorn out. But I guess one of the questions that I have, and Lori, to answer your question, at my school, we're responsible for a circle. We have, an advisory period. We have 10 or 12 kids. I work with another adult, and we're actually expected to do circles on a weekly basis, and they give us scripts for those circles. And as people have mentioned, I think the act of going through a formal script is important, because when harm does occur, kids are clear about what the expectations are. I guess my next question, and this is just to everybody, is, and I'll answer my own question just a little bit, but like, why are circles and restorative practices important now, like in this time? And what are some of the challenges that we're seeing with the restorative practices and the implementation? We've already mentioned some of those challenges. And I just I'm going to answer my own question just a little bit. And I work in a sustainability program, and we connect with organizations that support folks who are experiencing a lot of challenges, whether that be food insecurity or they're not accessing resources. And some of the things that I've been hearing about are these ideas of mutual aid, that when people need help, we need to marshal the resources of the community and support folks. And our belief is that that's going to be happening more frequently with issues like climate change. Why now? We need to make sure that we're building strong relationships in our community and give students experience with those relationships. And then the other piece is that it seems to me that there are more folks out in our communities struggling, and that making sure they understand the community cares about them is really important. And there's this idea of radical empathy, that we're going to be empathetic and caring no matter what, and that's going to help us make sure that we can create that sense of belonging, not only in our communities, but maybe even in our classrooms and in those small groups. And that with COVID and with what's going on in the world right now, with a lot of conflict, you're seeing kids are feeling that, if not experiencing it. And so bringing these strategies into the classroom seems really important. I'm also going to address one of the challenges is the implementation and the time that we're given to do this work, because it's not necessarily quantifiable and it takes long periods of time to build those relationships. And I'm actually going to pass it to Evie, because we've had a conversation before about how some people believe restorative practices replace discipline. It's a discipline. And so that also is a challenge. And again, I'll hand it off to Evie. Why restorative practices? Why now? And what are some of those challenges?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll note I have to head out right at 4 o'clock. So if I disappear, thank you for letting me join. I think right now, at least the thing that's coming up for me when I think about that is like, we're seeing that penalization and like criminalization of students, like through, like punitive discipline isn't necessarily effective. And there's a really clear link between that and like the disproportionate impact that has on our students of color. Right. And it speaks to the school to prison pipeline, like all of those pieces that I think are a result of that like sort of penal justice system that schools have operated for a really long time. And through restorative practices, we can sort of mitigate some of that disproportionality that happens by focusing on relationship building and learning rather than punishment as a way to sort of feel like we've fixed something. But I think the challenge that comes with that is that at least in my school, what I see is that students have caused each other some really, really deep harm. And it does require people to want to engage with each other. Like the restorative practices, it requires that people want to engage. You can't force a restorative conversation. It requires people to want to take responsibility for their actions. And we have teachers and students alike who are not willing to do that. And that is like, I think probably the number one barrier that I see to restorative practices. And I think that also goes hand in hand with what I think Katie was saying at the beginning around this idea of Indigenous knowledge and perspectives, right? It's a real culture clash in our predominantly white institutions. And teachers and students alike, like Dawn said, really want consequences. And so holding a restorative conversation doesn't often, I think, feel to people as if it's enough, even though oftentimes, I think, in my perspective, it's a much more appropriate response. But there are I think, so many barriers around engagement and culture and things like that.
Thank you very much. Other comments, thoughts, or ideas? Go ahead, May.
I think something that feels challenging around a lot of this is that we continue to learn what we need in our schools and continue to encounter justification for why these things aren't being put in place. We need data. We need to do these assessments. Like we need to do, and I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm just saying, like, I feel like we learned so much from COVID about what kids need and what the structure of the day and what school is. I did go to that Act 77 celebration, and it was just so mind-blowing and fascinating and fabulous. And so I'm curious about a high school perspective, I guess, because I wonder why in the middle school we continue to impose these structures and systems on kids and not the structures and systems that we know could work for them. I see little kids just coming to school struggling, like they just are not ready for school yet, or kids in my team that school is not seen as a space for learning, despite lots of really caring, loving effective adults, like, and so I guess what I'm wondering is where there's places where this is working, where restorative practices are working well, and the data or the information is right there in front of us. What will it take for schools to acknowledge it? I hear the struggle with adults and buy-in. We see that, but boy, oh boy, there were some really powerful examples last week of where high schools were making an incredible difference for kids. And I don't understand why that's not happening, why it's not trickling down as effectively for middle schoolers.
Thank you, Meg. Other folks, contributions, ideas?
I'll just jump in for 1 second. This is something I've sort of been a proponent for over the last year or so. Is, you know, one of the challenges that I see, and a couple of people, including I think Evie, already alluded to it, which is this traditional idea of discipline, and wanting to have a concrete consequence, and thinking that restorative practices is swinging away from that, like they're polar opposites or something like that. And a phrase that my counterpart Andrea has been using a lot lately is compassionate accountability, and thinking about the fact that folks need structure. Folks need to have guidelines to work within in order to feel a sense of safety and security, right? And so it's not allowing chaos. It's not allowing people to act as they wish without any level of recourse, but it's really thinking about what's the purpose of that. And so a big part of what I've been focused on is how do we just reframe the language we're using and the purpose that we're implementing our accountability measures with. You know, one of the things that's hardest is, you know, if somebody's been convicted of a crime and been incarcerated, there's a stigma that is going to follow them for the rest of their life. We're seeing that in our schools with suspensions, right? Suspension is a stigma that then follows them through the rest of their life. So why are we continuing to use that language that is clearly putting them at a deficit? And what is the real purpose of that act? If the purpose of that act is to give the community that was harmed time to heal, that makes complete sense, right? We need to give people time to process and heal. And we need to give the individual who perpetrated the harm time to reflect and think about how they're going to re-enter that community in a way. And we need to help to facilitate that. But that's not what suspension is in most cases. It's, we want to get rid of you for a period of time so that we don't need to deal with you. And that just, it's even greater harm that's being caused because you're throwing the person out of the community. It's destroying relationships rather than trying to think, like, how do we rebuild them? And so I'm just really trying to think about it, and I don't have an answer for this, but systemically, how do we reframe or rethink our approach? And it doesn't mean that we're changing our practice completely, but we're changing the reasoning, the purpose, the thinking behind the practice is what really needs to change. And I think one of the other big challenges, at least for us, I don't know if this is true for everybody else, is we don't have the human resources to do it and do it well. You need people that are going to be designated to really help facilitate these rebuilding sessions and processing with students and getting to the heart of what went on that we need to repair. And that's a really hard thing for classroom teachers to do, given that you're probably teaching a classroom most of the day. And so who are the people who are going to help to make this happen? And how do we make sure that everybody can still be involved?
Thank you very much, Kyle. Other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I have a pretty concrete high school example, and I think what is it's in Burlington High School, as well as Burlington Middle Schools, though. I think one really important component of their restorative practices that they're implementing starting this year, after doing lots of legwork and trying to get it off the ground, is a restorative code of conduct. And there's also a restorative code of conduct in the works right now at Lamoille North Supervisory Union as part of our equity work there. And I think one thing that I think high schoolers are really amazing at is advocating for policy-based changes. So an example of the restorative code of conduct in Burlington, and it's kind of associated with a project that Christy and I were doing, where students who had been suspended and had experienced suspension disciplinary data were tasked with looking at, as a part of a youth adult team, tasked with looking at racial disparities in the discipline data and trying to brainstorm, like, what do we want to see? What do our parents and families and caregivers want to see as far as changes embedded into the way that school functions? And so while that was like a huge ask of those students and staff members that were on that team, like, I think that takes an incredible restorative mindset to allow students who have experienced discipline data to take 6 entire days off of the school year to like learn collaboratively and be a part of a youth adult team trying to do transformative change and leadership. So that's one. And of course, with anything, there's always positives and negatives, but I think that is like something that's really foundational. And a part of that restorative code of conduct, as far as like the thing that happens, an example that I found really effective within that restorative code of conduct is when hate speech is used. And when hate speech is used by a white person, there is a protocol of learning that has to occur after hate speech is used by a white person, right? If hate speech is used by a person of the global majority, there's a different process of learning that occurs, and it's like through a relationship with a person. But there's a different process of learning if you're a person of the global majority who uses hate speech. And I just think that's a really restorative and identity-based component of that code of conduct. So I'm excited that more communities are starting to dive into that restorative code of conduct, because it brings that policy to, like, it helps create that systemic structure.
Katie, can I just ask a quick question? I'm so sorry. Am I allowed to do that, Don? Like, I don't, it's just that.
No, of course.
No, I know, but I mean, like, I don't want to interrupt if someone else was going in, but something I'm realizing about some of this, right, is that it can't just be like, oh, here's here's a restorative code of conduct, everybody, and you put it out there. It has to be done by the work in the system, right? Like, it can't just be adopting somebody else's code of conduct. It's certainly, here's a concrete example of something, but I think what I'm hearing is that, like, this really has to be the boots on the ground of the community, of the people that are doing it. And I think that's where we don't always, I don't know what we need for like social media or like the blast of the information to help folks understand and see where these examples are in play. Just a point.
And I can speak to just the power of having youth look at policy. I think with both Milton and with Colchester, we've had teams where they're looking at actual drafts of like the district equity policy and giving feedback directly to the superintendent or the equity coordinator. And just that alone, inviting young people into creation of policy. I mean, I think that is foundational to this work. Not saying, this is what you have to do because we say so. It's like, well, what does this look like? What does our community look like? And that has been so powerful to watch youth engage with admin, as they converse about aspects of a policy.
I'm sorry, this is so interesting to me, and my mind kind of starts going, and what I start thinking about is the sophisticated, and forgive me for going in this direction, but I start to think about the sophisticated lesson and unit planning opportunities there would be within this type of thing. Like when you have a central question, what is justice? and is justice for all, right? And you start with a question like that, and then all the literature and the current events and the historical examples that you can provide to kids. Because then I start thinking about 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. What skills do they need to have so that, number one, they can recognize opportunities to look at policy and to ask the question, why can't I be involved? And that sort of, what skills do they need to say, we want to be in on the decision making that's impacting our communities and our lives. And then beyond that, I also think in my work with Up for Learning, this idea of why aren't we providing youth more opportunities to take part in this? And when a youth partner does have the opportunity, what are the skills that they could be working on in our classrooms that will allow them to take advantage of that and to communicate and make a difference, effectively? The language, the presentation skills, the facilitation, the collaboration, and the problem solving, just to name a few. And so, like, I'm backtracking all the way to, when we're having a circle and then we're having a class and we're building our norms, how are these the foundational elements that will eventually lead to kids being able to ask the right questions and have the skills to make what Katie Ingraham said it was, this transformative change, and to actually make policy that's going to be appropriate for them, made by them. So that's just kind of my take on the last few comments, and I deeply appreciate those. Joe or Katie Farber, any comments or thoughts?
You got any, Joe? Man, my brain's a little bit all over the place. I'm just harkening back to one of the comments earlier around, I think Meg, it was you who was saying something like, you're under so much pressure for this quantitative data around, this test or this assessment and the way this should be, and that there's not a lot of, quantitative data. But I would surely, to support restorative practices and spending the time and effort on it, but I would say, wow, isn't there quite a bit of qualitative data that points to the necessary structures of what is justice and community and why we need it in schools? And so, it's just so interesting to just pull back on the forest for the trees and talk about, we can look at your behavioral outcomes, we can look at your attendance, we can look at your, what is happening in the school for our needed data to support this. It's just that when the flashlight is being, focused on what teachers need to do, this is often not where it's pointing, right? So that is just making me think about that. It also makes me think about that, closing that gap between, when you'd have a student that you had to send to the principal or something and they would come back and there was no like real communication of what happened. And so what that does is it can really foster, of course, you all know, this negative connotation with whatever had happened. And then there's this lack of communication around it. So bridging the gap between, if there was something restorative that had happened so that the teachers know about it and they're well-versed in the language and the processes, then we're like connecting. Because I think that there's a PR problem when there's a lack of communication between what's happening behaviorally. I've seen that happen, and then particular things like restorative circles or something can get a bad name when you have the communication lapses, and it's not the actual concept, it's just the communication lapse. So those are just some things I've been thinking about listening to everybody else.
Thank you. Joe?
Well, I have many thoughts, but I guess what I would toss out is that school has been a place where we've tried to identify the skills, habits, and knowledge that could help young people in the present time, and then also give them more options in the future. And my big problem right now is trying to identify what those things are. What are the skills, habits, and knowledge that really will help them now and in the future? So much of society is moving and changing so quickly right now. COVID has certainly caused a real disconnect between generations. And as far as trust and truthfulness and expectations and safety, all those sorts of things have really been tossed around a lot. And then with AI and other tools that are available, what skills do young people need to have? I think there's just a lot of uncertainty right now, and it's causing every institution to look within themselves and then struggle with where to go next. And so some places are grabbing on the test scores about, whether you're moving 2 points in, a certain amount of time. And then other places are just throwing everything out and saying we're all equal, even though society so far for the last few 100,000 years has been a hierarchical system. What are the hierarchies that are going to emerge and be the structures that are going to allow us to feel like we're part of something that's good? I don't have answers for those things, but I don't know that we're really trying to ask those questions right now either. And I'm hoping somebody will start asking them and start looking at those things.
Thank you, Joe. Always something to ponder, and I appreciate it. And I really appreciate everybody showing up and talking about this, because I think at the end of the day, it's really important for our students and for our communities. And I think, as Joe alluded to, our communities and our students seem to be facing, a lot of challenges right now, and helping to support them with loving and empathetic communities is really important. What I'd like to do in closing is to just ask folks to, I know it's the end of the year. The next time we meet is going to be on January 18th in 2024. And we're almost to the point where we start, or if you haven't already, start reflecting on this year's past. And if we could just close with folks putting something grateful that they're grateful for in the chat. And you can read what folks put, and then we'll close it for the day. I want to thank Lori Ramirez for showing up. Really appreciate it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email us. And thank you all for all the work that you're doing to provide the education that our students and communities deserve. Again, have a wonderful holiday season and a break if you get one. And just put one thing that you're grateful for in the chat, and then we will see you in January. And happy holidays, everybody.
No doubt.
That's awesome. So I hope you all have a wonderful break and happy holiday with your families. Get some time to relax. Thank you always for the work you're doing. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds
Be
good.
well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.
Take good care.